Walmart is now a war zone. Shelves are ransacked, aisles are barricaded with overturned carts, and screams echo as people scramble for supplies. Shelves are empty, stripped bare. A woman clutches an empty saucepan in the homeware aisle, tears streaming as she mutters something about feeding her kids. As trucks grind to a halt and roads become lifelines for survival, the unthinkable becomes reality. Food and medicine vanish, leaving over 345 million Americans desperate. Raids on large box stores began days ago, but now the true weight of the catastrophe finally sinks in, and millions of desperate people attempt to hoard away as many supplies as possible. Armed groups have sprung up across the country. Some are neighbors banding together to keep their homes safe. Others roam the streets, guns drawn, looting stores and seizing supplies like scavengers. Police officers and military veterans have abandoned their oaths and are now leading raids to seize whatever they can. Streets erupt in chaos as violence reigns. The echoes of gunfire and screams drown out the memory of an America that just a week ago stood as the unchallenged leader in science, military might, economic power, and cultural influence. 3 days before the event, the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, alongside advanced space weather satellites like the Deep Space Climate Observatory, captures a powerful solar storm the moment it erupts across the sun's blazing surface. This is no ordinary solar flare. The massive coronal mass ejection, or CME, is a record breaker, releasing more plasma energy in seconds than humanity has produced in its entire history. And Earth is directly in the firing line. The warning takes just over 10 minutes to get to Earth, and at first scientists are perplexed, suspecting an error in the data. But when the Deep Space Climate Observatory and its sister satellites all begin sounding the same alarm, realization dawns. This is no mistake. It's the largest CME event ever recorded, dwarfing even the infamous Carrington event of 1859 that overloaded the United States' then new telegraph network. In fact, this CME is rivaled only by one humanity experienced over 14,000 years ago, evidenced by unusually high radiocarbon levels preserved in fossilized tree stumps. While this event is theorized to be the greatest CME ever recorded, recent discoveries reveal a startling pattern. These mega CMEs regularly occur every few thousand years, and Earth has long been overdue. 2.5 days before the event, within hours of detection, a global alarm has been raised. The sheer number of detectors involved makes it impossible to keep the news of the incoming CME a secret. Scientists, not known for their secrecy, broadcast the alarm through official channels and even platforms like Threads. Around the world, leaders are being rushed into emergency disaster preparation meetings, scrambling to keep a level on the growing level of pandemic among the public. Chinese censors immediately clamp down on all mention of solar storms or coronal mass ejections across social media. State-run news agencies acknowledge an unusual solar storm, but they downplay its severity, omitting any mention of its unprecedented scale. Instead, in an effort to keep the population calm and streamline preparation efforts, citizens are directed to locations for the best views of the resulting aurora displays. There's no indication that this CME is a game-changing monster of a storm. Elsewhere in the world, information flows more freely, despite efforts by authorities to suppress widespread panic. Confusion reigns as disinformation agents exploit the situation, spinning the news for their own purposes and agendas. Stores are already being overrun by frantic shoppers stockpiling emergency supplies, but in general, the mood around the world is one of disbelief. True panic hasn't set in yet. Humanity is unwilling to accept the true scope of the calamity about to befall the planet. But first, have you ever wanted to build a city of your own and lead it through history? Do you have what it takes to start with a tiny village and turn it into a massive empire spanning thousands of years? If so, then you have to try out the sponsor of today's video, Forge of Empires. Forge of Empires takes you on an epic journey through time, letting you grow your city from the Stone Age to the Space Age, manage resources, develop your economy, and unlock legendary buildings, like the Colosseum or Notre Dame, to give your city an edge. But it's not just about building. You'll lead armies, conquer territories, and even team up with friends and guilds. And right now is the perfect time to jump in. Complete the tutorial as a new player to grab 25 Forge points, 1,000 coins, and 1,000 supplies. And when you reach the Bronze Age, you'll unlock the Welcome event, a board game style challenge where you'll earn 150 raffle tickets, 2 golden dice throws, and level up your trading post to get a serious advantage, but only if you use my special link. And the best part, Forge of Empires is playable right in your browser. No downloads required, or it's also available on your phone or tablet. So what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description, claim your rewards, and start building your empire today. 2 days before the event, The United States government is fully preparing for a national emergency. Military forces from around the world have begun the process of recall. Estimates on the impact of the storm range wildly. Some predict it'll be a catastrophic event, wiping out all electrical infrastructure around the world. Others believe that the effects will be significantly weaker, though still massively disruptive. Hedging its bets, the United States recalls foreign forces from far-flung posts and begins the process of consolidating into key strategic areas. Europe, Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, Guam, Japan, and Hawaii in the Pacific. Emergency services across the country brace for action. The primary challenge lies in coordinating national logistics for an unprecedented crisis, one that may cause minimal physical damage but threatens to annihilate the nation's entire electrical grid. If the worst happens, the fallout would be catastrophic. Years to restore power regionally and over a decade before electricity flows across the entire U.S. again. Key equipment such as transformers are being rushed into heavily populated areas and safeguarded in protected shelters. One day before the event, store shelves around the world are beginning to run empty. The White House has suspended all payment for groceries and other critical goods. Police, National Guard, and reserve forces are set up across major shopping hubs to enforce compliance as the nation falls under martial law. Each family is allocated a certain number of goods, and retailers are forced to provide them free of charge. The United States government, should it survive, will reimburse retailers at a later date. Projecting an image of calm confidence, authorities managed to stave off the widespread panic many feared. Yet, nearly half the population succumbs to conspiracy theories, convinced the event is a hoax designed to justify martial law. In today's post-truth world, these conspiracies spread like wildfire across social media, fueling anger and distrust toward the government. As people dismiss official warnings to prepare for the worst, the stage is set for disaster. This will lead to tens of millions of desperate people being caught without any critical reserves of food, medicine, or other supplies. Hour zero. Impact. The leading edge of the solar flare collides with the Earth's magnetic field, a natural force field that shields all life from the sun's deadly radiation. Under the immense pressure, the magnetic field buckles, twisting and folding in on itself. Charged particles pierce through the upper layers of the magnetic field and are forced along its curves up into the poles of the planet and then down toward the equator. All sun-facing satellites are overwhelmed by a tidal wave of charged particles. Those in high Earth orbit are hit first and hardest, lying far beyond the densest regions of the Earth's magnetic shield. Their electronics are supercharged to the point that they burn out completely. 1,000 satellites are rendered useless pieces of space junk in nanoseconds. Almost instantly, the effect ripples down to lower Earth orbit. Telecommunications satellites, GPS satellites, weather monitoring satellites, every single piece of space infrastructure that humanity depends on is drowned in a tsunami of electromagnetic energy. Earth is in a digital blackout. American military satellites are built to withstand the effects of an artificial EMP, a legacy of Cold War fears. Designed to resist a Russian nuclear detonation in space, their hardened systems form a critical shield for the U.S. military space-based network. Yet, the coronal mass ejection event is so powerful, it overwhelms the protections on most of these satellites as well. A handful survive, leaving the United States military the best suited to survive the coming apocalypse, but not by much. Even if a satellite survives, its orbit is directly affected by the electromagnetic push from the sun. With ground stations soon to be knocked offline, issuing corrective orders will become impossible, leaving these satellites adrift. The International Space Station is abandoned in a miraculous last-minute evacuation made possible by the efforts of U.S. commercial space partners. The station itself will be rendered useless due to its electronics being completely fried. Small fires break out to finish the job, and in zero gravity they spread rapidly. The pride of human space ambitions will be nothing but a smoldering wreck. With no control systems to guide its descent, the ISS is doomed to an uncontrolled re-entry. In roughly a year and a half, it'll plunge into the Earth's atmosphere over Central Europe, unleashing a deadly shower of debris that claims hundreds of lives on the ground. The electromagnetic energy surges into Earth's atmosphere, pushing the planet's magnetic field to its breaking point. Long-distance communications fail instantly, plunging the world into silence as critical connections disappear. Aircraft in flight lose all GPS signals and contact with air traffic control, left to navigate blindly in a rapidly deteriorating situation. As the electromagnetic energy engulfs them, catastrophic failure of onboard electronic systems becomes inevitable. Ramjet generators can provide electricity in case of a power failure, but the electronics themselves have been completely burned out. The aircraft can still be flown manually, But without instruments and no way to communicate, successfully reaching an airport, let alone landing, is incredibly unlikely. Hundreds of thousands will die from air crashes alone. Charged particles provide electric currents in high transmission lines, wreaking havoc along electrical grids around the world. The worst impacts are on the sun-facing side of the Earth. Transformers are burned out and the electric grid begins to fail regionally. Hour 2. The geomagnetic storm continues to rage as charged particles from the sun continue to bombard the planet. Transformers and high-voltage transmission lines are overwhelmed. Older power grids are hit first and hardest. Their outdated infrastructure lacks the tolerance needed to withstand the electromagnetic interference and massive power surge unleashed by the solar storm. Entire swaths of the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Central America all experience complete power grid collapse. In regions where the grid is more modern, the electrical infrastructure is more resilient. However, the onslaught of charged particles is such that it eventually overwhelms these newer grids as well. Television, cell phone, and radio services are down all over the world. Every day, humanity fills the air with electromagnetic energy of its own, transmitting signals from Earth to space satellites, from cell towers to individual cell phones, and from radio transmission towers to receivers. Yet, in one instant, the Earth goes electromagnetically silent. For the first time in 150 years, human communications are instantly sent back to the pre-industrial age. With personal electronics being ubiquitous all around the world, hundreds of millions of people experience painful electric shocks as their devices are overwhelmed by induced currents. Some of these devices have batteries that react violently to the induced electric current, setting off a series of small explosions that maim and injure. Cell phones are useless bricks, and any phone in a protected location is still useless with no network to connect to. Hour 8. Power outages now affect the entire country. New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, Chicago, America's largest cities all fall silent. Even most cars will no longer start up, with modern vehicles reliant on electronic starting mechanisms. Only vehicles built before the digital revolution are unaffected, but that leaves the vast majority of motorists without a working vehicle, and this includes emergency services. With communications completely down, police and military are forced to rely on runners to relay critical messages. Old motorcycles are put into use, but large emergency vehicles are just as useless as the family sedan. U.S. military vehicles are a different matter altogether. These vehicles are a product of the Cold War, where fighting was expected to continue even in the midst of all-out nuclear war. That means they make limited use of electronics or are completely hardened against the effects of the solar storm. Some are overwhelmed, and more complex vehicles such as fighter aircraft are harder to economically shield. America's Air Force, stronger than the next 5 competitors put together, is reduced to a fraction of its size in an instant. Day 2. The power has now been out in most places for over 18 hours, with no region left untouched. However, the side of the planet that faced away from the sun at the time of the storm's arrival has fared slightly better. Unfortunately for the United States, it was sun-facing when the solar storm hit, bearing the full brunt of its fury. Ironically, the least affected area is the Indian Ocean, one of the more sparsely populated and least developed regions on Earth in terms of human infrastructure. In Asia and Australia, the damage is just as critical. Older or less developed infrastructure is completely overwhelmed and destroyed. Some Chinese cities manage to retain power flow due to more modern electrical infrastructure, but this is temporary. With global communications erased, logistics will break down and these cities will also soon go dark. Emergency services, meanwhile, are completely overwhelmed with injuries and fatalities caused by the effects of the storm. Fires have broken out across the world from overloaded electrical grids. Firefighting services are having difficulty responding or even being made aware of these outbreaks. With many of their own vehicles no longer functioning, options on fighting fires are extremely limited. Some older construction equipment still operates, and bulldozers and backhoes are recruited into the job of creating fire breaks inside of major cities. Entire swaths of infrastructure are leveled in an attempt to stop the spread of out-of-control major fires. Day 3. Efforts to repair the electrical grid begin. There's some long-range communications possible thanks to Cold War preparations the United States had made in prior decades. This includes storage of high-frequency radios in sheltered locations underground, buried deep beneath the surface. Communication cables crisscross the country, providing a critical lifeline. These cables, sheltered from the electromagnetic chaos, allow the president to maintain contact with major command and control nodes across America. The problem with repairing the electrical grid is the sheer scale of the job. Nearly every transformer across the United States has been destroyed or seriously damaged. In many places, the transmission lines themselves have been physically damaged. Thanks to an emergency stockpiling of transformers, the work can begin, but it will take a year just to restore power to select locations in America. Places like New York and Los Angeles will be amongst the first to see electricity flow again, if they can survive the social unrest that's thrown much of the world into lawlessness. Week 1. Without power, refrigerated food stores have spoiled, leaving shelves empty and millions without access to fresh supplies. Agricultural equipment critical for planting and harvesting has failed, grinding food production to a halt. The materials farmers rely on, seeds, fertilizer, and fuel, are now unobtainable as commercial logistics collapse entirely. Once capable of feeding 5 times its population, America is forced to revert back to pre-industrial era techniques. Even at peak efficiency, America cannot feed its current population of 335 million. With the collapse of law, order, and transportation, achieving anything close to peak efficiency is now impossible, leaving the nation on the brink of a catastrophic food crisis. The government has made agriculture a priority, but its best efforts will only see American farmers able to feed barely a quarter of the American people, and that is with mandatory rationing. This means 252 million people are doomed to starve to death in the coming weeks. Month 1. It's remote areas near major population centers that are starting to see some electricity flow again, given the simplicity of their power grid. The U.S. military is forced to fortify these areas to prevent them from being overrun. As predicted, 250 million desperate, starving people have completely overwhelmed America's stockpile of emergency supplies. For the first time in history, the U.S. military is heavily engaged in combat within its own population, as hordes of desperate survivors seek to overwhelm the few safe areas that exist. America is awash in its own blood, and in the chaos, several states have officially announced their departure from the American Union. The federal government responds with swift reprisals, needing the collective resources of the entire nation to keep it together. But within the next few months, America as we know it will collapse under the strain. The nation will shrink down in size considerably, given the difficulty in maintaining order and control without reliable long-range communications. By the start of the second month after the crisis, 75% of the world's population has died, either of illness, injury, starvation, or violence. Many millions more will die before a modicum of order is restored. Rebuilding the world to its former technological heights will take decades, as entire communication and electrical grids must be dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. Use of animal labor is once more widespread, given the lack of availability of working vehicles. But fuel transportation networks have also collapsed, making it impossible to deliver much-needed gasoline and diesel. Some nations will be far worse affected than others. The United States, given its geographic diversity and relative preparedness thanks to Cold War paranoia, will be amongst those that fare better. Within a few decades, swaths of the United States will see a return to a new normalcy, though matters of territorial integrity will have to be resolved either via diplomacy or violence. However, nations heavily reliant on imports will vanish nearly overnight, like the legendary Atlantis. Dubai, a shining jewel of excess, will become a modern-day Atlantis as the city collapses into anarchy and its population either flees or dies. With few natural resources and a completely inhospitable location, Dubai simply cannot support more than a tiny fraction of the 3.6 million people who make their home there. The world that emerges from this solar catastrophe will be unrecognizable, a shadow of what existed before. Humanity itself will take centuries to recover fully. However, with so many of the Earth's natural resources already exploited to critical levels, one question remains: is there enough of them left to truly restart an industrialized global information age civilization? Without the momentum of today's infrastructure and technological advancements, humanity's ability to rebuild is deeply uncertain. There may not be enough resources left to fuel our rise from Earth into a broader intersolar civilization. This single solar storm has doomed humanity to an early extinction. The most chilling truth, however, lies beyond fiction. Scientists now believe that these devastating events are a regular occurrence for our sun, and we are long overdue for another one. Thanks again to the sponsor of today's video, Forge of Empires. Start building your empire, research technologies, and explore history today, all right in your browser. And don't forget to use the link in the description for additional rewards when completing the tutorial and reaching the Bronze Age. Now go check out What If the Earth Stopped Spinning, minute by minute, or click this other video instead.